Without further ado, I'm going to introduce someone who I admire enormously, and I'm sure I speak for all our panelists and audience members too, Albie Sachs, who is a legendary human rights fighter and someone who has dedicated his life very productively to the struggle for human rights in South Africa, but has also been an inspiration, of course, to many of us around the world. I think some of us have had the opportunity of hearing Albie talk on different occasions, and every time you hear him, your heart just rises with the sense of an obligation to do more and to do better. So we could think of no better way of ending our book launch on Human Rights Day than inviting Albie Sachs, former Constitutional Court judge of the South African Supreme Court and one of the chief architects of the post-apartheid South African Constitution.
Well, let me just start off by saying, wow, it's not a great academic term, but it's been, and I am tired because this is my 5th International Human Rights Day presentation, and each one is completely different, but this has been the richest by far. And I was kind of puzzled because you invited me some time ago to contribute to the book, and I sent in a sort of a thought piece, and the next thing I see, it's the introduction to the book. I think it's the first time I've had an introduction to a book that I haven't even read. I didn't even know what the other entries were, but I did have a few ideas, and I wasn't sure when I agreed to take part in the discussion whether or not, having heard the discussion, I could still stand by the ideas now that they introductions or conclusions to themes that I actually knew not very much about. But I think my 2 main points still are valid, and I'm going to add them. But with the preface of saying, this is such a rich interaction, and it was so lovely to see equal voice being given to people from very diverse backgrounds, some from the communities that have been the subject of the oppression and the violation in the past, continues today, others as scholars interested in the themes from different countries, looking at different continents, different places, but that same central heartbeat, if you like, mind beat and heartbeat. If the mind can beat and the heart can think, the two kind of go together in this situation. It's engaged scholarship at its richest and most valuable. And it doesn't soften my dilemmas, which I'll come to in a minute. If anything, it increases, intensifies them. But I think dilemma is at the heart of investigation. And I'll explain why I'm saying that. The first is the very concept of reparation. A little bit of research I did reminded me that reparations historically were what the victorious warriors demanded from the defeated people. And after World War II, sorry, First World War, which of course wasn't called First World War then, because they didn't know there'd be a Second World War. After that World War, heavy reparations demanded from defeated Germany, and whole factories were moved. Money had to be paid. And that was the understanding of reparations historically in international law for maybe a couple of centuries. Don't take us on again in any war, because if you lose, we're going to grab a lot of stuff from your country as reparations for having had the cheek to either make war against us or defend against us when we attack you. After World War II, because of the Holocaust, partly because of the Cold War and the need for Western Germany to be seen as a bulwark against Soviet expansion and so on, competing with East Germany, the question of some kind of compensation to the survivors of the Holocaust, Jews, emerged, and the term reparation became associated with compensation, money to be paid to victims of atrocious conduct. And it was an absolutely valid and necessary act that was undertaken then. It wasn't profound in Germany itself. In Germany itself, in a sense, the payment was easy. It was the second, third generation of young Germans saying, what were you doing? Where were you? How could this happen? That was profound in terms of changing the mentalities, changing the outlook, and extremely important. It had nothing to do with the payment of lump sums of money to victims, which I totally support, by the way. There's no, that's not problematic at all. But the problem that does emerge is that the dimension of reparations, which has become pronounced and predominant, is the dimension of monetary compensation for criminal, atrocious, violent conduct, misconduct in the past that continues often today. And I feel that, in a sense, the emphasis on money, cash payments, is debilitating a more profound reparations movement. I think early on, one of the speakers said, it's not only money. I would say it's not money. It can include money, but the repair aspect has to be something much more profound. It enables us to conceptualize the reparations theme, not on the analogy of taking somebody to court to get injury for smashing into your motor car or killing the breadwinner of your family. Remove the reparations theme from that form, or the fine that you pay because you've been found guilty in a criminal court, and make it much more profound and much more related to the nature of the injury and the kinds of remedies that could appropriately be found. And I was wondering, why did I feel so strongly about this? There are lots of themes and ideas you feel, yes, no, maybe. Here I feel strongly about it. And it's partly personal. When I was planning to come back to South Africa, having been blown up by a bomb put by apartheid agents in my car, one of my lawyer friends said, "Great, Albie, now we can sue the bastards." And I felt actually affronted by that. I felt shocked by that. I felt it's commodifying pain and injury. This is my arm, and it was part of me, and it was part of our endeavor. I was a volunteer, we were fighting for freedom, and I'm proud that I was in the struggle and that I survived the struggle. And our reparation came through the Constitution, through transforming our society. And that's what validates for me the endeavor that ended up my losing my arm. It's the restoration of dignity, it's the validation of idealism, it's the hope, it's the acknowledgement of what it was all about coming out in other concrete forms. And in a weird way, the emphasis on compensation, it just occurred to me, thinking what I should say now, would almost be the triumph of neoliberalism. You pay out, you buy out, you've compensated, it's over. Where's the problem? That putting it in an extreme way. And it's also foreclosing other avenues, which we've heard about, restoring the stolen objects, apologies, forms of education and support that could be so rich and valuable. In the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, we had 3 commissions. One was hearing the truth, hearing the stories. Very powerful, very emotional. It was acknowledging the pain, listening to people, and saying to yourself, where was I? What could I have done? I think it was an American political scientist said the purpose of the Truth Commission was to convert knowledge into acknowledgement. Money doesn't convert knowledge into acknowledgement. That's owing a debt. Acknowledgement is phenomenological, it's understanding, it's spiritual, it's imaginary, it's profoundly educational and profoundly meaningful to the people who were victimized. That what they went through and what they're going through is acknowledged by the world. The second part of acknowledgement came from the perpetrators. To get amnesty, they had to acknowledge what they'd done. And it was deeply significant. It doesn't leave room for denialism, because the very perpetrators, sometimes following orders, sometimes giving the orders, came forward and said, I did this. And maybe one of the most powerful moments in the whole process was when one of the persons who'd been tortured said to the torturer, tell me, Sergeant Benzine, how can one human being put a wet bag over the head of another human being and make them suffocate and think they're going to drown? How can one human being do that to another? It was so powerful. And the torturer cried. This man had been all powerful, he wept. Now people remembered because they could identify emotionally with situations like that. Money, in that sense, wasn't involved. The third commission dealt with reparations, and that was the one that had the least impact. The feeling in amongst many people in government is now it's the Mandela government paying out for the crimes committed under apartheid. Under apartheid, the whole nation suffered. Why should 20,000 people get money? But it was done in a callous way. There was delays in the payments. The amounts were never enough. And the people who hadn't had money suddenly get $10, $20, $30,000. It's spent very, very quickly. And there's a sense of emptiness afterwards. The money wasn't a solace. The money was important for poor people. It is a signifier. I'm not saying it should never be used, but if the emphasis had been more on finding community actions, getting the companies that benefited out of apartheid to contribute something in a meaningful way in their neighborhoods, if communities could have been mobilized. There was one bridge that was built over a railway line. That's what people wanted in honor of a freedom fighter who died under police fire. These things are deeply meaningful. Cash payments, I think, are not the way to go. They can be the way to go. I think the Romani people clearly feel that there's this massive inequality, that Jews got compensation, often quite handsome, and we are decades later still battling. It's a form of non-acceptance of the violations that were done to them. It's not even the money coming through. So I'm not saying money shouldn't be used, but I think in a way it could liberate the reparations movement if it wasn't seen as identified with cash payments, because the cash payments for what was done 200 years ago, 100 years ago, it's going to be difficult to justify. The current community should say, why are we paying now to people who didn't suffer directly themselves what happened a century ago? It's not going to get very far. Whereas if you deal with the continuing themes of marginalization, disregard, disrespect, indignity that continue from those days to the present day, I think that will go much further. It can be statues, it can be restitution of looted property, it can be a whole range of different things, but get people involved. From the benefited community involved in the process themselves, linking up with people from the oppressed community. The very last proposal I'm making, and this is all very much on the wing, themes in my lifetime that have started off with a concept that seemed very remote have begun with the concept. The concept has become a declaration. The declaration has become an international instrument. The international instrument gets absorbed in local law. The environment is one example of that. These crazies who had the idea of greening the world, and it seemed absolutely loopy. But the next thing it's catching on, and now people are rushing to show how green conscious they are. High leaders of major corporations and governments. So I think the reparations theme is somewhere in that conceptual idea. It's powerful, it's strong, it's rooted in real human experience and massive injustice that's palpable and tangible. And it's basically moral, it's basically decent. And maybe one can think in terms of some kind of international declaration on reparations that enlarges the theme, the concept of it, that doesn't simply say, you got to pay us so many millions or billions or trillions or quadrillions for the harm that was done. I hate human endeavor being reduced to a market thing with a dollar sign on it. There's something wrong if that's the way we go, which is not to say dollars don't count or Deutschmarks don't count or pounds don't count or francs don't count. But this is what emerges to me from having listened to this very marvelous and rich discussion that, as I said, have intensified the contradictions in my own head about this whole project and whole process. So thank you to the Harvard group for setting it up, for bringing us all together, for enabling us to hear and learn from each other. And thank you for bringing out the book.